All right, this is Chapter 31, The Politics of Boom and Bust, the Roaring Twenties from 1920 to 1932. Obviously, the 1920s, as a roller coaster, you saw the markets go up, 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 and then come crashing down. You also realized that you had post-World War I recession at the beginning, and you moved on to some big prosperity, and then finally the big crash in 29. Three Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, are going to steer the nation during the 1920s. And keep in mind, these guys all took somewhat of a laissez-faire approach. You see a shift from progressivism of the 1910s. So what you have is a move to cooperation, government cooperation with big business. So less direct government action. Again, that idea of laissez-faire. The first president that we're going to have and talk about is Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was considered one of the best liked men of his generation, yet he was rather weak and inept. An individual who kind of hated to say no. One of his campaign promises was to make sure or promise that he was going to have the best minds available with regards to his cabinet. And so we're going to take a look at a couple of these and decide whether or not these guys are the best minds or moral halitosis in his evil associates. And again, halitosis is bad breath. So are these guys good or are they bad? First guy, Secretary of State, is Charles Evans Hughes. Charles Evans Hughes, of course, was a good friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. Very loyal guy, also very smart. He was good. He was one of those best minds. In the Treasury Department, you had a guy by the name of Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was known as the Aluminum King. Also had an amazing art collection and eventually donated all of that to the people of the United States or for the government to take care of in D.C. Andrew Mellon would be okay. He would be probably one of the best minds. His Secretary of Commerce was a guy by the name of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, as you recall, was head of the Food Administration during World War I with Woodrow Wilson. He also will drum up an amazing amount of business, foreign trade for U.S. merchants during his time there, and he will grow the Commerce Department big time. He was good. He was one of those best minds. The Secretary of the Interior, a guy from New Mexico by the name of Albert B. Fall, and with a name like Fall, he's going to be bad. His Attorney General, a fellow Ohioan, Harry M. Doherty, small-town lawyer, he will also be bad. That's Harry Daugherty, D-A-U-G-H-E-R-T-Y. Again, this is a period of laissez-faire plus helping business. By helping business, it allowed those monopolies, or the government would allow these monopolies, as well as helping them set up trade associations and helping them become very profitable. Again, the laissez-faire part all was less direct government action. You'll see this in the Supreme Court. Warren G. Harding, interesting, in 3 years will pick 4 of the 9 justices, including Taft as Chief Justice, former President William Howard Taft. Their choices and decisions, somewhat reactionary. They will axe some progressive legislation, such as Atkins versus Children's Hospital. Atkins versus Children's Hospital, again, took away no minimum wage for women and reversed Muller versus Oregon. In other words, that special protection for women, mostly because, well, the 19th Amendment made them politically equal. And so no need to give them special treatment. In the section Aftermath of War, you're looking at some of the characteristics during the Harding years. You'll notice that the government did return railroads back to private ownership. They did get out of the shipping business. Labor will struggle during this time. mostly because, if they're going to help and allow big business and monopolies to go, that's going to be kind of a hit against labor. In 1921, they will create the Veterans Bureau in an effort to try to build and run hospitals and provide rehab for a lot of these World War I vets. Speaking of those World War I vets, they are going to push Congress for a bonus bill. Congress will pass this bonus bill of 1922 and present it to Harding, and Harding, interestingly, Harding vetoes this. They didn't stop there. The veterans are going to push Congress to put something else together, and so they'll come up with what's called the Adjusted Compensation Act of 1924. This would be a paid-up insurance policy that these vets would get in 20 years. Calvin Coolidge is now president, and he will veto this measure, but Congress will override it, and so these veterans will expect a nice hefty paycheck in about 20 years. With regards to isolationism and then disarmament, you really have to realize they kind of regarded the League as a bad thing. But the whole idea with how things were going on during this time, especially like with oil or world health, sound familiar? The U.S. just couldn't ignore all of these things. Harding will be prodded by business people who were very unwilling to pay out for war stuff. But you will see a major naval contest with Britain and Japan, which will eventually lead to the Washington Conference in 1921. All right, this Washington Conference from 1921 to 1922, you're going to see all major powers there, except, of course, Russia, the Bolsheviks. And the reason why? Obviously, because the U.S. hadn't recognized the Soviet Union or the Bolsheviks at this point in time, so they weren't invited. The major idea behind this conference was naval disarmament, and of course, they would talk about oil as well. In what was the 553 or five-power naval treaty, there they talked about ships and the building of ships, especially military vessels, and they had this ratio, and the United States and Great Britain were the 5 and the 5, and of course Japan was that 3, and Japan wasn't real happy about that. But at the same time, Japan would be kind of compensated a little bit as Great Britain and America would concede that they would refrain from fortifying their far eastern possessions, including the Philippines, but the Japanese weren't subjected to that type of restraint. And of course, they're going to build up a lot of those areas big time, and that'll become known by World War II. All right, and again, as you kind of look at kind of what's happening here, and as we get this isolationism, disarmament, as we look at the Kellogg Brain Pact especially, you're going to see kind of a lack of realism in the United States towards a lot of things, whether it's towards the economy, whether it's towards international or foreign affairs. You're going to see this lack of realism. Speaking of the Kellogg Brain Pact, this again was kind of a pact brought together by the United States and France, and it literally was just saying that countries had to really swear to absolutely no wars. again, you can see kind of the false sense of security here with regards to the American mood in the country, that to think that this would actually work. But quite a few countries actually do sign this and figure that we no longer will have war, that it's over. Obviously, that wouldn't be the case. With regards to tariffs, we're going to look at what direction and why. Obviously, the direction is going to be higher. And really, the reason behind that was to keep those profits at home. One of the issues was that the United States really feared this flood of cheap goods from Europe after the war, and so they thought they would need this protection from all of those outside vendors. It will cause honestly, Europe kind of feels the squeeze here, and as a result, they're going to raise their tariffs as well. And that will end up causing some very serious economic stress around the country, around the world, actually. Interestingly, this kind of gives Hitler a bit of a platform to stand on with regards to what's going on around the world. The problem with agriculture is just simply overproduction. During World War I, obviously, they're going to produce like crazy. But machinery and wartime boom, that's going to come to an end after the war. And so peace brought an end to those government guaranteed high prices and massive purchases by other nations. And so foodstuffs began to surplus. And so there was obviously a problem with overproduction. Fortunately for them, a couple of things here. The McNary-Haugen bill, in an effort to try to keep prices high by government buying surpluses and then selling abroad, ends up being vetoed twice by Coolidge, and as a result, farm prices stay down. This becomes kind of a troublesome thing during the 1920s that was kind of a sign that there were problems in the economy. In the 1924 election, very sectional. There's a map on page 728, or you can even look at the one on the screen here. Republicans run the conservative, Calvin Coolidge. In the blank there would be the word conservative. Democrats run John W. Davis. And the progressives run our man from Wisconsin, fighting Bob La Follette, the liberal from Wisconsin. That should be in the blank there, liberal from Wisconsin. The Progressive Party, supported by the American Federation of Labor. Secondly, the Socialist Party. And thirdly, farmers. I know it only has a 1 there, but those 3 blanks are filled with American Federation of Labor, Socialist Party, and farmers. Why weren't the liberals and progressives more successful? Probably the biggest thing is that prosperity was with the conservatives. As a result, it's going to kind of stay with the conservatives. The Progressive Party really had a head, La Follette, and a few others, but no body. They really fielded a presidential candidate and no one in Congress or state and local levels. And that doesn't bode well for that party. On pages 728, 729, you're looking at the money picture of the 1920s. World War I makes the United States a creditor nation. Obviously, we were loaning money to Europe. The problem is allies were not paying back their debt. As a result, you're going to see them protest that this repayment plan is kind of unfair and that the United States should write those loans off as a war cost. The reason being they paid with a lot of Allied blood. They also claim that the United States took advantage of them, staying out of the war to rake in a lot of money. And then the tariff, of course, also makes things more difficult as well. Kind of not allowing European manufacturers to be able to sell their products to world markets definitely hurts. It hurts Europe, but it hurts the United States eventually too. In an effort to try to deal with this, in 1924, they come up with what's called the Dawes Plan, pretty much known as the financial merry-go-round. U.S. bankers will eventually loan money to Germany, which allows Germany then to pay reparations to France and Britain, which allows those former allies, France and Britain, to then pay debts to the United States. This all comes to an end, obviously, with the crash of 19. Disregard that. And let's go to the election of 1928 real quick. Coolidge makes the announcement here that I choose not to run, and so the Republicans go with Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover's platform is prosperity and prohibition. He's also a conservative. He really firmly believes in what's called rugged individualism, and that kind of describes his life, and that's kind of why he sticks with rugged individualism. In other words, if you don't have something, do something about it. Radio plays a big role for the first time, and actually will favor Hoover because the Democrat Alfred Smith has kind of his voice is really hard to hear on the radio. He's really got that New York dialect. It's a landslide victory, obviously 444 to 87 in the electoral vote. And you're going to see a real strong push on American individualism, free enterprise, and smaller government. In other words, again, the government staying out of business. Interestingly, Hoover is an extremely good administrator and usually had the people that work for him call him the chief. The Democrats, Alfred E. Smith, when we say that he's a wet, that means that you got prohibition going on right now, but he wasn't really honoring that. In other words, he was still drinking. He found ways to have alcohol. He was 4-term governor of New York. He was also Catholic. And keep in mind that the United States still had a strong persecution against Catholics as well as Jews during this time period. He's also a liberal, very urban city guy. So, all right, let's take a look at Hoover's efforts towards agriculture. First of all, we'll take a look at the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929. Here, it gave loans to farm organizations to buy, sell, and store surpluses. It had a federal farm board that was meant to bolster sagging prices by buying up those surpluses. Problem with this, though, is it's just suffocated by huge excess and low prices. Then you've got what's called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930. The Hawley-Smoot, what a name, huh? Is the highest peacetime tariff ever. Highest protected tariff in the nation's peacetime history. You're looking at going from about 38.5% to almost 60% on dutiable tariffs here. So it eventually will plunge the world deeper into depression. The Great Crash, October 29th, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday, you're going to see unemployment jump to 25%, 1 in every 4 unemployed by 1933. What happened? Money was just gone. About $40 billion in paper value just disappeared. It evaporated. It's just gone. About 5,000 banks eventually closed in the first 3 years. The Federal Reserve kind of took Federal Reserve really kind of just feared that as everything was going so fast, if they released money, it would probably go as well. So their belief was keeping money in the hands of the wealthy, not into salaries or wages. And so they didn't push a lot of money out there. Eventually what happens is you're going to see a lot of people just out of work and out of homes, and eventually you're going to see these little shanty towns pop up, little tin and paper shanty towns known as Hoovervilles. Obviously the name coming from blaming the president who is in office while this happens. All right, what caused the Great Depression? Obviously overproduction in many different areas, from farming to different industries. The world economy was weak. Keep in mind, you're coming off of World War I here, and a lot of these countries in Europe are really trying to get back on their feet. And the problem is you all of a sudden get these tariffs going higher and higher and higher, and that really kind of stops world trade, which is not good for anybody. Adding kind of injury to insult here, you get, again, the Dust Bowl. Dust Bowl is just going to really kind of destroy a large portion of the Great Plains area, and we'll talk more about that later. Overexpansion of credit, a lot of these installment plans, also the buying of stock on margin buying. Again, the whole idea was for investors to try to get rich quickly. And of course, stocks were very overvalued, and people were buying them on credit and being sold them on credit, and it just wasn't a good thing. And then you had the panic. Things just kind of got out of hand. That bubble popped and panicked. Everyone wanted to quickly try to sell as quickly as they could to get what they could for their stock, and it just forced prices to fall terribly. You're kind of seeing that right now a little bit. Just what people were really hoping to avoid, but that's what's going to happen when you do that. The measures that Hoover took to try and fix this, obviously, he was rugged individualism. He still kind of was convinced that he wasn't going to give handouts. He felt that handouts would simply weaken America. If you just sit there and give people, they'll have no incentive to want to try to earn it or get it themselves. He tried to assist big business. That Reconstruction Finance Corp, the whole idea behind that was kind of a government bank. It wasn't for the people, it was really for banks and major corporations. But he thought if he did that, it would simply trickle down to the people. It really didn't. He did have one public works project going on, and that, of course, was the Hoover Dam. And then the Norris LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act. No injunction to stop strikes. It outlawed yellow dog contracts, which were anti-union contracts. Interestingly, Republicans will lose big in the 1930 congressional elections, which made things worse for Hoover, but really kind of set things up for FDR. A couple things at the end here. The bonus army. These were vets that wanted their pensions now, not 1945. Remember, they had that 20-year insurance policy. They wanted it now. Most of them were out of work, and so they're going to march on Washington and try to pressure Congress and Hoover to pass that, to give them to them now. It doesn't, and what happens is that Hoover orders them to evacuate, and the guy called to duty here is General MacArthur. And so he approaches them with bayonets and tear gas, and it's just a massive, just a really bad situation. And Roosevelt actually believes that this is kind of one of the things that'll get him elected. Then on the world affairs, Japan attacks China, and obviously the League is really kind of handicapped to do anything about it, especially without the United States part of the League. And so in many ways, World War II is born on the plains of Manchuria in 1931. Interestingly, the League could have halted it, but they simply lacked the courage, and that'll play out again in Europe in a little while too. Hoover's good neighbor policy, Americans had less money to invest abroad, and so he starts to withdraw troops in Central America in 1934.